There's a moment, quiet and almost accidental, when you notice that you have gone an entire day without thinking about them. Not because you tried, not because you forced yourself to look away or gritted your teeth through another wave of longing you refused to indulge. You simply didn't think about them, the way you don't think about a name you used to know well and now only recognize in passing, the way you don't think about a song that once meant everything and now plays in a grocery store without doing anything to your chest at all. This is not the moment people warn you about when they talk about moving on. Nobody tells you it arrives like this, unannounced, almost boring in how little ceremony it carries. You expect indifference to feel like a victory lap. Instead, it feels like Tuesday. This is the story of that Tuesday and everything it means and everything it takes from a person who once believed you would always, on some level, be reaching for them. The moment indifference becomes real. For a long time after it ended, you were still in some quiet corner of yourself in relationship with them. Not the relationship itself, which was over, but the shape of it, the residue of it, the habit of orienting some part of your attention toward a person who was no longer actually present in your life. You checked, you wondered. You noticed when a mutual friend mentioned their name and felt something tighten in your stomach before you could stop it. You constructed, without meaning to, an entire inner theater where you imagined their reactions to your life, rehearsed conversations you would probably never have, kept a running tally of whether you were doing better than them, worse than them, moving on faster or slower, healing more gracefully or less. All of that was still, in its own painful way, a form of caring. It was caring dressed up as vigilance, as self-protection, as closure-seeking, but underneath all of those respectable names it was still attention pointed at them, still energy spent on a person who had already spent yours. The moment indifference becomes real is not a moment of triumph. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or a soundtrack. It arrives the way silence arrives after a long time of noise, which is to say you almost don't notice it until you realize how long it's been since you heard anything at all. You reach for the old habit of checking and find there's nothing behind it anymore, no charge, no anticipation, no dread. You see something that would have once sent you into a spiral, a photo, a name, a memory triggered by a place you used to go together, and you feel it register the way you'd register any other piece of information about someone you used to know. Interesting, maybe, neutral, mostly, and then gone, replaced by whatever you were actually doing before it interrupted you. This is what makes indifference so different from every other stage that came before it. Anger has a temperature, grief has a weight, even the numbness of early heartbreak has a texture to it, a dullness you can feel pressing on your chest. Indifference has none of that. It is not a feeling you have about them. It is the absence of feeling anything about them at all, and that absence is so quiet, so undramatic that you might live inside it for weeks before you understand what has actually happened to you. What has happened is this: they have stopped being a reference point. Your days no longer bend around the question of where they fit into your story, what they think of you, what they're doing, whether they've changed, whether they miss you. Your days have simply become your days again, full of things that have nothing to do with them, populated by a version of you that exists on her own terms, not in relation to someone else's presence or absence. You did not decide to feel this way on a particular morning. Nobody wakes up and chooses indifference the way they choose an outfit. It builds slowly out of 1,000 small refusals, 1,000 moments where you didn't check, didn't respond, didn't let your mind wander toward them when it wanted to. And then one day you look up and realize the building is finished, that somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary days, the structure of caring simply stopped standing, and what's left in its place is just you, unoccupied by anyone else's weather. What indifference actually is. It's worth being precise about what this feeling is, because it gets confused so often with things it isn't. Indifference is not numbness. Numbness is a wall you build because feeling is too dangerous, and underneath a wall like that, the feeling is usually still very much alive, just buried, just waiting for the right crack to come flooding back through. Indifference, the real kind, the kind that comes after actual healing, is not a wall at all. It's an open field. There's nothing buried underneath it because there's nothing left that needs containing. You're not suppressing anything when you don't think about them. You're simply not thinking about them because your mind has better things to attend to, because the emotional infrastructure that used to route so much traffic in their direction has been quietly, patiently dismantled. It's also not the same as pretending. So many people, in the early aftermath of a breakup, perform indifference as armor. They post the confident caption, they let it be known through a mutual friend that they're doing great, they build an entire persona out of not caring, and all of it is theater, because underneath the performance they are checking every hour, aching every night, desperate for the person to see how unaffected they appear to be. That kind of performed indifference is exhausting precisely because it requires so much energy directed at the person you're supposedly indifferent to. You cannot perform not caring about someone without caring quite a lot about what they think of your not caring. Real indifference doesn't perform anything because there's no audience it's trying to convince. It doesn't need them to see it. It doesn't need anyone to see it. It exists whether or not it's witnessed, which is exactly what makes it real. And it is not coldness, though it will sometimes be mistaken for that by people who don't understand the difference between someone who has hardened and someone who has simply healed. Coldness is a defense against feeling, an armor plated over a heart that's still afraid of being hurt again. Indifference toward one specific person born out of genuine recovery is not a diminishment of your capacity to feel. If anything, it's evidence of the opposite. The same person who feels nothing when they see an old photo of their ex might cry at a stranger's kindness, might feel their chest ache at a piece of music, might fall deeply and warmly in love again with someone new. The indifference is not a general shutting down. It is specific, targeted, and it exists precisely because so much emotional energy has been freed up and redirected toward a life that actually deserves it. Understanding this distinction matters because it protects you from a particular kind of self-doubt that tends to creep in during this stage. You might ask yourself if something is wrong with you for not caring anymore, especially if the people around you are still invested in the story, still asking how you're doing with all of it, still expecting you to have feelings about someone you've quietly stopped having feelings about. There is nothing wrong with you. There is something exactly right with you. You have done the long, unglamorous work of untangling your nervous system from someone else's presence, and the outcome of that work is not supposed to be dramatic. It's supposed to be quiet. It's supposed to feel, eventually, like nothing at all. The old cost of caring. To understand what indifference gives you, it helps to remember, honestly and without flinching, what caring actually cost you while it lasted. Not the caring you felt during the relationship itself, though that had its own price, but the caring you carried afterward, in the long stretch of time when the relationship was over but your attention hadn't gotten the message yet. Caring in that phase looked like checking a phone that wasn't going to buzz with the message you wanted. It looked like scrolling past a name on a screen and feeling your whole body react before your mind had time to intervene. It looked like rehearsing conversations that would never happen, building elaborate cases in your head for why you were right and they were wrong, replaying arguments and coming up 3 years too late with the perfect thing you should have said. It looked like measuring your own healing against a story you were telling yourself about theirs, wondering if they were doing better, wondering if that meant something about how much you'd actually mattered, wondering if their apparent ease meant you'd been easy to leave. All of that constant, low-grade attention was expensive, and you paid for it in ways that were easy to miss because the cost was distributed across so many ordinary moments. It cost you presence with the people who were actually in front of you because some fraction of your mind was always elsewhere, tallying, monitoring, waiting. It cost you sleep on the nights when your thoughts wouldn't stop circling back to a conversation from months ago. It cost you the full experience of new things, new people, new possibilities, because a part of you was still comparing everything against an old measuring stick that had no business still being in your hand. Caring about someone who is no longer in your life is not free. It draws from the same well that everything else in your life draws from, and the more of it you spend on them, the less there is for you. What makes indifference so valuable, then, is not that it erases the past or pretends the relationship never mattered. It's that it returns the well to you. All that attention, all that energy, all that careful, exhausting monitoring, it doesn't just vanish when you stop caring. It goes somewhere. It goes back into your work, your friendships, your body, your actual present life, the parts of your existence that were quietly starving while you kept feeding a story that had already ended. When people say that moving on is its own kind of accomplishment, this is what they mean. It's not that you defeated anyone. It's that you reclaimed something that was always yours to begin with, and you gave it back to the person who deserved it most, which was never them. It was you. How indifference was built, not declared. Nobody arrives at genuine indifference by announcing it. You cannot decide in a single moment of resolve to stop caring about someone and have it simply be true from that point forward. Indifference isn't a declaration. It's a structure built slowly out of 1,000 small acts of discipline that rarely feel significant while you're doing them and only reveal their cumulative weight much later, when you look back and realize how far you've come without quite noticing the walking. It was built the first time you didn't respond to a message that would have once sent you spiraling into a 3-hour analysis of what it meant. It was built every time you closed the app instead of checking, Every time you let a memory pass through you without following it down whatever rabbit hole it wanted to lead you into. Every time you chose to sit with a feeling instead of acting on the impulse to reach out, to explain yourself, to be understood by someone who had already made clear they weren't interested in understanding you at all. None of those individual choices felt like healing in the moment. Most of them probably felt like restraint, like willpower, like the unglamorous work of not doing the thing you wanted to do. But restraint practiced consistently enough eventually stops being restraint and starts being your actual nature. The thing you had to force yourself not to do becomes the thing you no longer want to do at all. This is why indifference can feel, when it finally arrives, almost anticlimactic. You spent so long fighting for it, white-knuckling your way through moments of weakness, that you expected its arrival to feel triumphant, to feel like winning. Instead, it feels like waking up one day and realizing the fight is simply over, not because you won some dramatic final battle, but because there was, at some point, nothing left to fight. The urge you used to have to check on them, to know what they were doing, to understand how they were feeling about you, that urge didn't get defeated in a single confrontation. It got starved slowly by every day you didn't feed it, until it stopped showing up altogether. It's worth honoring this process rather than skipping past it, because the people who talk about indifference as though it's simply a switch that flips are doing a disservice to everyone still in the middle of building it. If you're in that middle right now, if you still feel the pull sometimes, still catch yourself wondering, still have moments where an old wound reopens without warning, that doesn't mean indifference isn't coming. It means you're still in the construction phase, still laying the small, invisible bricks that will eventually add up to a wall so solid you'll forget it was ever built at all. The signal they are no longer finding. There was a version of you once that was legible to them, predictable in the specific way that people who love someone are predictable to the person they love or once loved. They knew, or believed they knew, how to reach you. They knew which messages would land, which silences would unsettle you, which small gestures of attention, however inconsistent, would be enough to keep you oriented toward them even when nothing about the relationship had actually improved. That legibility was not something you chose. It was simply what caring about someone looks like from the outside. When you care about a person, you respond to them. You give them information about your inner state just by existing near them, by reacting to what they do, by being reachable at all. What changes when indifference sets in is not that you become a different person. It's that the signal they used to read so easily simply isn't there to read anymore. A message that once would have provoked a reaction, however small, now provokes nothing they can detect because there is nothing to detect. Not because you're hiding a reaction, but because the reaction doesn't exist. You are not performing calm. You are not concealing hurt behind a composed exterior. There is quite simply no interior event happening for them to try to read, and a person who is used to being able to read you will notice that absence long before you ever have to tell them about it. This is disorienting for anyone on the receiving end of it, and it's not something you need to think much about because it isn't really your responsibility. But it's worth understanding anyway, because it explains something that might otherwise seem strange. Why silence from your side sometimes provokes more activity from theirs than engagement ever did. A person who is used to being able to affect you, even negatively, is navigating by a kind of feedback loop. They do something, they watch for your reaction, and your reaction, whatever it was, told them where they stood. When that feedback loop goes quiet, they lose their instruments. They can no longer tell whether they matter, whether they've been forgiven, whether they've been forgotten, whether you think about them at all. And a person without instruments tends to fly a little more erratically for a while, testing different approaches, trying to find the frequency that used to get through. None of that is your concern to manage. You are not responsible for giving them back their instruments. You are not obligated to perform a reaction just so they have something to navigate by. The absence of signal is not cruelty. It is simply the natural consequence of a nervous system that has stopped being organized around another person, and if that absence is disorienting for them, that disorientation is the cost of a system they no longer have access to, not a debt you owe them. Why silence now feels different. There was a time when silence from them was a weapon, and silence from you was a wound. Their silence in the old dynamic was often strategic, a withdrawal meant to provoke anxiety, to remind you of your place in the hierarchy of their attention, to make you work a little harder for the crumbs of engagement they eventually offered. Your silence in that same dynamic was rarely a choice. It was usually forced, imposed by their absence, filled with everything you wanted to say and weren't given the chance to. Silence back then was never neutral. It always meant something, always carried a message, always had a direction and a purpose behind it. The silence that exists now is a different animal altogether, and understanding the difference matters because it's easy to mistake the current quiet for the old kind, to feel a flicker of the old anxiety when things go quiet for a while, to wonder if this silence too is strategic, is meant to communicate something. It isn't. This silence isn't a message. It's just the natural sound of two lives that no longer intersect. There's no strategy behind it, no waiting game, no test of who will break first, because there's no game being played at all. It's simply what happens when two people stop being part of each other's daily architecture. The absence of contact isn't a statement, it's just the truth of the situation, unremarkable and unweighted. This is one of the clearest markers that indifference has actually taken hold, more reliable than any grand declaration of being over someone. It's the moment you notice a stretch of silence, days or weeks with no contact, no thought of contact, no anticipation of contact, and you feel nothing about it at all. Not relief exactly, because relief still implies there was tension to be relieved. Just neutrality, just the ordinary quiet of a life that has stopped orbiting around the question of when you'll hear from them again, or whether you want to. Silence used to be loud in its own way, full of implication and dread and hope you didn't want to admit to having. Now it's just quiet. It's just what the space where they used to be sounds like, which is to say, nothing much at all. What you no longer need from them. There is a specific kind of freedom in realizing, plainly and without drama, everything you used to think you needed from them that you have simply stopped needing at all. You used to think you needed an explanation, a full accounting of what went wrong, delivered in language that finally made sense of everything that had confused and hurt you. You used to think that without that explanation, you would be stuck forever, unable to close the loop, unable to fully move forward. And then, somewhere along the way, without the explanation ever arriving, you moved forward anyway. The understanding you thought was mandatory turned out to be optional. You built your own account of what happened, out of your own observations and your own hard-won clarity, and it turned out to be sturdier than anything they could have offered you, because it was yours, built on your own terms, not dependent on their willingness to be honest with you. You used to think you needed them to see how much you'd grown, to witness your healing, to register the specific and satisfying fact that you were doing well without them. That need has quietly dissolved too. Your growth doesn't require an audience anymore, and certainly not that particular audience. You are not building a life as evidence for anyone. You are building a life because it's yours to build, because it makes your days better, because it feels good to wake up as someone who is becoming more herself, regardless of whether that becoming is ever observed by the person who used to be at the center of your story. You used to think you needed to know they regretted it, that somewhere on some night they lay awake understanding exactly what they'd lost. That need, too, has fallen away, and its absence is one of the more surprising forms indifference takes. It's not that you've concluded they don't regret it, or that you've decided they do. It's that the question itself has stopped mattering to you. Their regret or lack of it doesn't change anything about your life now. It's not a variable you're tracking anymore. You've stopped needing their internal experience to validate your external one, and that stopping is not bitterness. It's simply the natural consequence of no longer needing anything from someone who is no longer part of your life. This is what real closure actually looks like, and it rarely resembles the closure people imagine when they're still in the thick of wanting it. It doesn't come from a conversation. It doesn't come from an apology, an explanation, a moment of mutual understanding. It comes from the slow erosion of your own need for those things, until one day you realize you've reached the shore without ever getting the boat you thought you needed to get there. The freedom of not needing an apology. Waiting for an apology is one of the most common ways people stay tethered to someone long after the relationship has ended, and it's a particularly cruel kind of tether, because it hands the keys to your peace directly to the person least likely to use them responsibly. An apology, especially from someone who struggled to be emotionally present or accountable while you were together, is not something you can compel. You cannot make someone understand the full weight of what they did. You cannot make them say the words in the order you need to hear them, with the sincerity you need to feel behind them. If your peace depends on receiving that apology, you have made your peace contingent on someone else's willingness to give you something they have already shown you, repeatedly, they may not be capable of giving. What indifference offers instead is the discovery that you can build a complete, satisfying, fully realized peace without that apology ever arriving. Not because you've decided you don't deserve one, and not because you've talked yourself into believing it doesn't matter, but because you've stopped organizing your healing around a transaction that was never guaranteed to happen. You've taken the apology out of the critical path. It would be nice if it came. It might even mean something in some small way if it were sincere. But your life no longer requires it as a prerequisite for anything. You have already forgiven yourself for staying as long as you did. You have already made sense of what happened using your own clarity instead of theirs. You have already extended yourself the compassion and validation you once hoped they would extend to you, and it turns out that self-generated compassion holds up just as well, maybe better, than anything that would have come from them. This is not the same as saying the apology doesn't matter or that what happened wasn't serious enough to warrant one. It's saying that your healing cannot be hostage to someone else's growth, someone else's insight, someone else's willingness to finally see clearly what they couldn't see while you were standing in front of them asking to be understood. The apology, if it ever comes, will be a small and mostly irrelevant footnote to a story you've already finished writing without it. And if it never comes, which is more likely, that absence will change nothing about the peace you've already built, because that peace was never actually depending on them to begin with. The freedom of not needing to be understood by them. There is a particular kind of ache that comes from being with someone who never quite understood you, who mistook your depth for intensity, your need for connection for neediness, your attempts at closeness for pressure they had to manage rather than intimacy they might have wanted to receive. That ache doesn't disappear the moment the relationship ends. For a long time afterward, you might still find yourself wanting them to finally get it, wanting one clear moment where they saw you accurately, where the misunderstanding that shaped so much of your time together finally resolved into something true. Indifference includes, among its many quiet gifts, the release of that particular want. You stop needing them to understand you, not because you've given up on being understood, but because you've found understanding elsewhere, in friendships that don't require translation, in a version of yourself that no longer needs external validation to know what's true about her. The specific person who once got you wrong doesn't have to get you right anymore, because your sense of yourself no longer runs through their perception of you. You know who you are. You built that knowledge slowly, sometimes painfully, in the aftermath of a relationship where you were so often misread, and now that knowledge belongs to you regardless of whether the person who misread you ever revises the picture. This matters because so much of what kept you invested in the early aftermath was the fantasy of the retroactive understanding, the idea that someday, somehow, they would look back and see clearly everything they'd missed while you were together. That fantasy is seductive because it promises a kind of vindication, a moment where the record gets set straight. But waiting for that moment means outsourcing your sense of being known to someone who has already demonstrated, at length, that being known by you was not something they prioritized. Indifference lets that fantasy go. Not with resentment and not with a slammed door, but with the quiet recognition that you don't need it anymore, because you've already found what you were actually looking for, just not from them. Not caring about their growth, their next relationship, their story. One of the more surprising features of real indifference is how completely it extends beyond the relationship itself and into every question that used to feel urgent about their life afterward. You used to wonder if they'd change, if the next person would get a better version of them, if all the effort you poured into trying to reach them would finally pay off for someone else, someone who came along after you'd already done the hard, invisible work of trying to teach them how to be loved. That wondering used to carry a sting, a specific unfairness, the sense that you might have been the training ground for a growth you'd never get to benefit from. Indifference dissolves that sting, not by resolving the unfairness, but by making the question itself irrelevant to your life. Whether they grow or don't grow, whether the next relationship goes better or repeats the same patterns, whether they finally learn the things you tried to teach them or carry the same blind spots into every future connection they attempt, none of it touches you anymore. Their story keeps going somewhere without you in it, and that continuation is simply none of your business. You are not required to track it. You are not required to have feelings about it. You do not need to know whether they've found happiness or whether they're still stuck in the same patterns, because either answer would change nothing about your own life, and a piece of information that changes nothing is not worth the energy of seeking it out. This is not coldness toward them, and it's not a wish for their failure or their success. It's simply the natural consequence of no longer being invested in the outcome of a story you're no longer a character in. You wrote your chapter. It ended. Whatever they write next belongs to a book you're no longer reading, and there is a real and specific relief in realizing you don't have to keep checking the reviews. Why this doesn't make you cold? It's worth returning to this point because it tends to surface as a worry, especially for people who were raised to believe that caring is a moral obligation, that letting go of concern for someone you once loved is a kind of failure of character. You might catch yourself feeling guilty for not caring anymore, as though the indifference is evidence that you were never really invested, that your love was smaller or more conditional than you wanted to believe. This guilt is worth examining directly because it rests on a misunderstanding of what love and care actually require. Caring about someone does not obligate you to care about them forever, regardless of what they did with the care you gave them while you were together. Love is not a debt that accrues interest indefinitely, payable no matter how the relationship ended or how badly you were treated within it. You gave real care, real attention, real effort for as long as the relationship existed and likely for a good while after it ended, while you tried to make sense of what happened and hold out hope for something different. That care was not wasted, and it does not need to continue indefinitely to have been genuine. It is entirely possible and entirely healthy to have loved someone completely and to no longer care about them at all. Those two facts are not in tension. The love was real while it lasted. The indifference is real now that it's over. Both things can be true without canceling each other out. What indifference actually reflects is not a diminished capacity for love, but a matured one. You have learned through this experience exactly how much of yourself you're willing to keep giving to people who are no longer giving anything back. You have learned to recognize when caring has stopped serving connection and started serving only your own anxiety, your own unfinished business, your own difficulty letting go of something that has already let go of you. Indifference toward this one person in this one specific context is not evidence of a colder heart. It is evidence of a heart that has finally learned where its energy actually belongs, the people who don't understand your peace. Not everyone around you will understand this shift when it happens, and that's worth naming plainly, because it can feel isolating in a way you might not expect. Some people, especially those who witnessed the worst of your heartbreak, who held you through the early months, who listened to every spiraling theory and every late-night text about what you should have said differently, get invested in your pain in a way that makes your eventual indifference feel almost disorienting to them too. They ask how you're doing with everything, expecting an update on a wound they remember being raw, and you tell them honestly that you don't really think about it anymore, and sometimes that answer lands strangely, as though it's too simple, as though it skips a step they were expecting you to still be on. There can also be people less well-intentioned who seem almost invested in you continuing to feel something, who bring the person up unprompted, who watch your face for a reaction they don't get, who seem, whether they'd admit it or not, a little disappointed that the story isn't still exciting, that there's no fresh development to discuss, that you've simply moved past the point where this used to be interesting. You don't owe anyone the drama of ongoing pain just because it makes for a better story or a more satisfying update. Your piece doesn't need to be legible to an audience. It doesn't need to make sense to people who are more comfortable with your suffering than with your recovery, and there will occasionally be people like that, even among people who love you, people who got used to a version of you defined by this wound and don't quite know what to do with a version of you that simply moved on. Let them adjust in their own time, or don't, as the case may be. Your indifference is not a performance for their benefit, and it doesn't require their understanding to be valid. You know what it took to get here. You know how many quiet, undramatic choices it required. You don't need anyone else's confirmation that the piece is real, and you especially don't need it from people who seem more interested in the story of your heartbreak than in the fact of your healing. Grief and indifference coexisting. It's worth being honest about something that doesn't always get said plainly. Indifference toward a person does not mean the grief around what happened is entirely gone. You can feel nothing about them specifically, no charge when their name comes up, no ache when you see their face, and still on occasion, feel a wave of grief for the relationship you thought you were building, for the future you imagined and lost, for the version of yourself who believed in something that didn't turn out to be true. That grief is not about them, not really. It's about the story you had to let go of, the plans you had to unmake, the time you spent hoping things would be different than they were. You can be fully indifferent to a person and still occasionally grieve the shape of what their absence left behind, and those two things are not contradictory. This distinction matters because it can be confusing when a wave of sadness arrives long after you thought you were done feeling anything about the relationship at all. You might interpret that wave as evidence that you're not actually over them, that the indifference was a fragile performance after all, cracking under the weight of an unexpected memory. But grief for a lost future is different from longing for a specific person, and it's possible, even common, for the former to visit you occasionally long after the latter has permanently left. You can miss the idea of what you thought you were building without missing them. You can grieve a version of your own life that never got to exist without wanting the actual person back at all. Give yourself permission to feel that grief when it arrives without treating it as a setback, without letting it convince you that your indifference toward them isn't real. Both things live in you now, the peace and the occasional ache, and neither one cancels the other out. What replaces the caring? When you stop spending your attention on someone, that attention doesn't simply vanish into nothing. It goes somewhere else, and one of the quiet joys of reaching genuine indifference is discovering, often gradually and without fanfare, exactly where all that redirected energy has landed. It shows up in the friendships you've had more room for, the ones that used to get your distracted, half-present self and now get someone who actually listens, who actually shows up, who isn't running a second conversation in her head about someone who isn't even there. It shows up in work you can finally concentrate on without an old ache pulling at the edges of your focus. It shows up in your own body, in sleep that isn't interrupted by rehearsed arguments, in a nervous system that isn't constantly bracing for the next piece of information about someone who used to have so much power over your emotional weather. It shows up, too, in the quality of your presence with new people, whether that's a budding friendship, a new interest, or eventually, when you're ready, someone you might build something with again. There's a specific kind of presence that becomes available to you once you're not quietly comparing every new experience against an old one, once you're not carrying a ghost into rooms that deserve your full attention. People can feel the difference, even if they can't name it. They feel that they're getting all of you, not a version of you that's still partially occupied elsewhere, and that fuller presence tends to draw better things toward you, not because the universe rewards healing in some mystical sense, but because people generally respond well to being fully seen by someone who isn't distracted by an old story. This is the practical, unglamorous payoff of indifference, and it's worth naming clearly because it's easy to think of moving on as simply the absence of pain, a kind of neutral resting state you arrive at and then stop thinking about, but it's not neutral at all. It's an active redistribution of everything you used to spend on them, back into a life that has been quietly waiting for its full share of your attention. That redistribution is happening whether you notice it or not, and noticing it, actually pausing to see where your energy has gone instead, is one of the more satisfying exercises available to you in this stage of healing. Old triggers losing power. There were things once that could undo you in an instant, a song that came on unexpectedly, a restaurant you used to go to together, glimpse from the outside as you walked past, a specific turn of phrase someone else used that reminded you, with startling force, of something they used to say. In the early aftermath, these triggers were merciless, capable of dragging you back into the full intensity of the loss with no warning at all, no time to brace yourself, no defense against the sudden flood of feeling. One of the clearest signs that indifference has taken root is the gradual, almost imperceptible loss of power in these old triggers. The song plays and you notice it's playing, and that's all that happens. You walk past the restaurant and think mildly that you used to go there, the way you might think about any other closed chapter of your life, without the thought pulling anything else along behind it. Someone uses a familiar phrase and it registers as nothing more than a phrase, disconnected now from the specific person who used to say it to you, because your mind has stopped automatically routing that association through them. This doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't happen in a straight line. Some triggers lose their power early, while others linger longer, and there's no real logic to which ones fade first. But over enough time, one by one, the landmines get diffused, not because you avoided stepping on them, but because you kept stepping on them anyway, again and again, until each one stopped having anything left to detonate. The world used to be full of small ambushes waiting to remind you of them. Slowly, without your noticing exactly when it happened, the world became just the world again, full of songs and restaurants and phrases that belonged to nobody in particular, least of all to a person who no longer has any claim on how you experience your own life. The version of you that used to need this. It can be worth pausing here to look back at the version of yourself who couldn't have imagined this feeling, the version who was still in the thick of it, checking her phone every few minutes, constructing elaborate theories about what a delayed text meant, unable to imagine a future where any of it stopped mattering this much. That version of you deserves compassion, not embarrassment. She was doing the best she could with a nervous system that had been trained over months or years to treat this person's attention as a source of safety, and unlearning that training takes time, takes patience, takes 1,000 small acts of choosing yourself over the old familiar pull toward them. You don't have to be ashamed of how much it hurt, how long it took, how many times you slipped back into checking after telling yourself you'd stopped. Healing rarely moves in a straight line, and the version of you who struggled through the messiest parts of it is the same version who eventually built the peace you're standing in now. She's not a separate, weaker person you've left behind in embarrassment. She's the person who did the actual work, who sat with the discomfort of withdrawal, who chose, again and again, not to reach out even when reaching out would have been easier in the moment. The indifference you feel now isn't a betrayal of everything she went through, it's the direct result of it. Every hard night she survived without breaking her own resolve is a brick in the wall you're now standing safely behind. It's worth thanking her honestly for that work, rather than looking back with any kind of embarrassment at how much it used to hurt. The capacity to feel that much, to care that deeply, to be that undone by someone's absence, is not a flaw. It's evidence of a heart fully capable of loving, and that same heart is now fully capable of peace, because it was never broken in some permanent way. It was simply, for a while, pointed in the wrong direction, and now it isn't anymore. Building a life measured by nothing they do. There is a specific kind of freedom in realizing that your days no longer contain a single reference point related to them. You are not measuring your outfit against whether they'd notice it. You are not measuring your success against whether they'd be impressed by it. You are not measuring your happiness against whether it would sting them to witness it. Your life has stopped being, even in some small subconscious corner, a performance staged for an audience of one person who is no longer watching, and probably never watches, and whose watching or not watching no longer factors into a single decision you make. This is what it actually means to get your life back after a relationship ends, and it's a more complete kind of freedom than the early, more dramatic milestones people tend to celebrate, like the first date with someone new or the first time you laugh without guilt. Those milestones matter, but they're still, in some sense, reactive, still defined against the backdrop of what came before. The deeper freedom is the one that arrives later, when your life stops being defined against anything at all, when the choices you make are simply the choices that make sense for you, unshadowed by any question of how they'd land with someone who isn't even in the room. You get to decorate your home according to your own taste, without a flicker of thought about whether they'd have liked it. You get to pursue a goal because it excites you, not because it would prove something to someone who's no longer paying attention. You get to rest, to celebrate, to fail, to try again, all without an invisible referee keeping score on your behalf. This is what indifference actually builds, underneath all of its quieter, less dramatic surface. It builds a life that belongs entirely to you, measured by nothing they do, responsive to nothing they say, indifferent not because you're trying to prove a point, but because there is, at last, nothing left in you that needs their input to feel complete. The difference between moving on and waiting to feel moved on. There's a strange trap that catches a lot of people on the way to genuine indifference, and it's worth naming clearly so you can recognize it if it ever catches you. It's the trap of waiting to feel done before you allow yourself to act done. You tell yourself you'll stop checking once the urge to check disappears on its own. You tell yourself you'll stop replaying old conversations once your mind naturally stops generating them. You wait for the feeling to arrive first, as though healing is something that happens to you passively, a weather system you simply have to wait out, rather than something you actively build through the choices you make while the feeling is still present and still uncomfortable. This waiting keeps people stuck for far longer than necessary, because feelings, left entirely to their own devices, are remarkably good at perpetuating themselves. The urge to check doesn't fade simply because time passes. It fades because you stop feeding it, because you interrupt the loop enough times that it eventually runs out of fuel. Indifference isn't something that happens to you while you wait patiently on the sidelines. It's something you build deliberately, through 1,000 small moments of acting like the person you're trying to become before you fully feel like her. You close the app before you want to. You redirect your thoughts before they've finished the sentence they wanted to say. You choose again and again to behave like someone who has already moved on, and eventually, almost without noticing the transition, you become her. This matters because it changes what you do in the moments when the old feelings resurface, as they sometimes will, even well into your healing. Instead of treating a resurfacing urge as proof that you haven't actually moved on, you can treat it as simply one more opportunity to practice the behavior that builds the indifference you're aiming for. The urge showing up doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human, and being human means occasionally getting an unwanted signal from an old, well-worn neural pathway. What matters is not whether the signal appears. What matters is what you do with it when it does, and every time you choose not to follow it, you're laying down one more brick in a wall that will eventually stand on its own, without you having to consciously maintain it at all. Trusting yourself again. One of the quieter casualties of a relationship with someone who struggled to be consistently present, consistently honest, or consistently kind was probably your own trust in your own perception. You likely spent a good portion of that relationship second-guessing yourself, wondering if you were overreacting, wondering if the coldness you felt was really there, or if you were imagining it, wondering if your own needs were reasonable or excessive. That kind of chronic self-doubt doesn't end the moment the relationship does. It tends to linger, showing up as a general uncertainty about your own read on situations, an instinct to defer to other people's interpretations over your own, a quiet worry that your perception of things can't quite be trusted. Part of what indifference rebuilds, alongside your attention and your energy, is this fundamental trust in your own perception. As the fog of the relationship clears, you start to notice how accurate your instincts actually were the whole time, even when you talked yourself out of trusting them. You remember the moments you sensed something was wrong before you had proof of it. You remember the times your gut told you to be cautious, and you overrode it because you wanted so badly to believe the more hopeful interpretation. Looking back at those moments with clear eyes is its own kind of healing, separate from but related to the indifference you feel toward the person himself. It's the healing of coming back into alignment with your own judgment, learning to trust the quiet voice inside you that was right more often than you gave it credit for. This rebuilt trust becomes one of the most valuable things you carry forward from this entire experience. It shows up the next time something feels off in a new relationship, in a friendship, in a work situation, and instead of talking yourself out of the discomfort, you listen to it immediately, without the months of internal debate it used to take. It shows up as a general steadiness in how you move through the world, a sense that you can rely on your own read of things without needing external validation to confirm what you already sense to be true. This is not a small gift. It is, in many ways, one of the most important outcomes of the whole difficult process, because a person who trusts her own perception is far less likely to end up, ever again, doubting herself into staying somewhere that isn't good for her. The new relationship with your own company. Somewhere in the process of building indifference toward them, something else quietly happened alongside it. You built a relationship with your own company that didn't exist, or existed much more thinly, before. During the relationship and for a long stretch after it ended, silence and solitude were often uncomfortable, filled with the noise of your own churning thoughts, difficult to sit inside without reaching for a distraction, a scroll, a message, anything that would quiet the discomfort of being alone with everything you were feeling. Solitude in that period was rarely peaceful. It was more often just the space where the missing and the wondering had the most room to expand. That has likely changed, gradually, without you fully cataloging the shift. Solitude now might feel less like an empty room waiting to be filled with anxious thoughts and more like an actual home, a place you can rest in without needing anything to distract you from being there. You can sit with your own thoughts now without those thoughts automatically drifting toward them, because your thoughts have so much less reason to drift there at all. You can enjoy an evening alone, a weekend alone, without the old restlessness that used to accompany unstructured time, the restlessness that always seemed to be searching for something or someone to fill the space. This shift is worth naming because it's one of the truest measures of how far you've actually come, more reliable in some ways than whether you feel anything when you see their name. A person who has genuinely moved on doesn't just stop caring about a specific ex. She develops an entirely different relationship with her own presence, her own company, her own inner world. She becomes someone who doesn't need to be constantly occupied or distracted, because being alone with herself has stopped feeling like a problem to be solved and started feeling like simply another way of being, one that happens to be quite peaceful now, quite comfortable, quite unafraid. What you notice now instead. Attention, once freed from its old obligations, doesn't disappear. It gets redirected, and it's worth spending some time noticing exactly where it has gone, because the answer tells you a great deal about who you're becoming. You might notice that you've started paying closer attention to your own body, to how certain foods make you feel, to the specific rhythm of exercise that leaves you energized rather than depleted, small acts of self-attunement that simply didn't have room to exist when so much of your inner bandwidth was occupied elsewhere. You might notice a renewed interest in a hobby you let fall away years ago, a book you finally have the mental space to actually absorb, instead of reading the same paragraph 5 times while your mind wanders back to an old conversation. You might notice, too, a different quality of attention toward the people who are actually present in your life, a fuller kind of listening, a capacity to be curious about someone else's day without a background hum of your own unresolved feelings competing for space. Friends might comment, without quite knowing why, that you seem more present lately, more engaged, more like yourself in a way they can't fully articulate but can definitely feel. That shift is the direct, tangible result of everything you used to spend on monitoring a relationship that no longer exists now being available for the relationships and pursuits that actually do. This redirection of attention is worth noticing deliberately, not just letting it happen passively in the background. Take stock every so often of where your mind goes when it's unoccupied, what it reaches for in idle moments, what interests have started to feel exciting again after a long stretch of feeling flat. This is the evidence, more concrete and more satisfying than any abstract sense of being over someone, of what indifference has actually done for you. It hasn't just removed something. It has made room for something else to grow in its place, and that something else is worth paying attention to. When old feelings try to visit. Even well into genuine indifference, it's possible for an old feeling to show up uninvited, triggered by something unexpected, a milestone you once imagined sharing with them, an anniversary of a significant date, a piece of news that would have once been the first thing you wanted to tell them. When this happens, it can feel disorienting, even a little frightening, as though the piece you thought you'd built has suddenly proven unstable, as though you're being pulled backward into a stage of healing you thought you'd left behind for good. It helps to understand that an occasional visit from an old feeling doesn't undo the progress you've made. Healing isn't a permanent, unbreachable fortress that either holds forever or collapses entirely the moment a single feeling gets through. It's more like a muscle that's grown strong enough to handle occasional strain without breaking. The feeling that shows up on an anniversary or triggered by unexpected news is not evidence that your indifference was fake all along. It's evidence that you're a person with a memory, a person who lived through something significant, a person whose nervous system occasionally still registers an echo of an old association, even after the association itself has stopped having any real power over your daily life. What matters in these moments is not whether the feeling shows up, but how quickly it passes, and how little it actually changes about your day once it does. In the early aftermath of the relationship, a triggered feeling like this might have derailed you for days, sent you back into checking behaviors you thought you'd abandoned, reopened conversations in your head you thought were closed. Now the same feeling might last an hour, an afternoon at most, acknowledged and then released, absorbed back into the general texture of your life without requiring any dramatic response. This is what healed actually looks like in practice. Not the complete absence of any feeling ever again, but the capacity to have a feeling pass through you without it hijacking your entire sense of where you stand. Becoming someone who doesn't need to win. There's a particular kind of maturity that arrives alongside genuine indifference, a letting go not just of the person, but of the entire framework of competition that so often shapes the aftermath of a difficult relationship. Early on, it's natural to think in terms of winning and losing, of who's doing better, who moved on faster, who ended up happier, who came out looking stronger to the people who watched it all unfold. This competitive framing feels satisfying in the short term because it gives shape and direction to pain that otherwise feels shapeless, but it also keeps you tethered to them in a way that's easy to miss, because as long as you're measuring your life against theirs, you're still, in some sense, playing a game with them, even if they don't know or care that the game is happening. Real indifference eventually dissolves this framework entirely, not because you concede that you lost, but because the entire concept of winning or losing stops applying to a relationship that has nothing left to contest. You're not trying to prove you're happier than them. You're not keeping score of who has moved on to a better situation. The question of who came out ahead simply stops being a question you're interested in, because it requires you to keep the comparison alive, to keep glancing sideways at their life to measure your own against it, and you've stopped glancing sideways altogether. This is one of the more freeing realizations available in this stage of healing, the recognition that you don't need to win anything, because there was never actually a contest worth having. Your life isn't good because it's better than theirs. It's good because it's yours, built on your own terms, unconcerned with comparison, unbothered by the question of how it stacks up against anyone else's. Letting go of the need to win is, in its own way, the final and most complete form of letting go, because it means you've stopped needing them in any capacity, even as a measuring stick for your own success. The quiet confidence of someone who has been through this. There's a specific kind of confidence that only comes from having survived something you once believed you might not survive, and if you've made it to genuine indifference after loving someone who struggled to love you back consistently, you are carrying that confidence now, whether you've fully recognized it yet or not. It's not the loud, performative confidence of someone trying to convince others and herself that she's fine. It's quieter than that, steadier, built on the simple, well-earned knowledge that you have already survived the worst of it and come out the other side more whole, not less. This confidence shows up in unexpected places. It shows up in how you handle new relationships, with a groundedness that doesn't panic at the first sign of imperfection, because you know now from direct experience that you can survive far more than a moment of uncertainty with someone new. It shows up in how you handle conflict, with a willingness to speak clearly and directly, because you spent so long in a dynamic where directness wasn't safe, and you've promised yourself you won't shrink that way again. It shows up in how you carry yourself generally, in a quiet certainty that you are someone capable of getting through hard things, because you have direct, personal, undeniable evidence that this is true. This confidence is arguably the most valuable thing this entire experience has given you, more valuable even than the indifference itself, because it will outlast this particular relationship and this particular person entirely. It will be there the next time life asks something difficult of you, whatever form that difficulty takes. You built it the hard way, through actual experience rather than reassurance, and nothing about that kind of confidence can be taken away by anyone, because it doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior or opinion to remain true. It is simply now part of who you are. What this means for who you become next. Indifference toward this one person and this one relationship is not the end point of your story. It's more like a threshold, the moment where the old chapter finally, completely closes and a new one becomes possible to write without the weight of the previous one dragging behind it. Whatever comes next in your life, whether that's a new relationship, a period of contented solitude, a shift in career, a deepening of friendships, a whole new set of goals you couldn't have imagined pursuing while you were still tangled up in the old story, all of it becomes more available to you now than it was before, precisely because you're not carrying the old weight into it. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to think of healing as primarily about closing a door, about finally being free of pain, without also considering what that freedom actually opens up. The energy you used to spend monitoring them is now available for building something new. The trust you used to withhold from yourself, second-guessing your own instincts, is now restored and ready to guide you more reliably through whatever comes next. The presence you used to split between your actual life and a phantom relationship that had already ended is now fully available for the people and pursuits in front of you. You are, in a very real sense, standing at the beginning of something now, not the end of something. The version of you who exists on the other side of this indifference is not simply a healed version of the person who went through the relationship. She's a more complete version of herself than she was even before it started, carrying forward everything she learned about her own resilience, her own worth, her own capacity to build peace out of what once felt like permanent chaos. Whatever she builds next will be built on that foundation, and it will very likely be stronger, wiser, and more fully hers than anything that came before. The body remembers differently now. Healing is not only a matter of thought and perspective. It lives in the body too, in the specific physical sensations that used to accompany any reminder of them, the tightness in your chest, the way your stomach used to drop at the sight of a notification, the particular kind of exhaustion that came from a nervous system braced, day after day, for information it wasn't sure it wanted. It's worth paying attention to how differently your body responds now, because the body often tells the truth about your healing before your conscious mind has fully caught up to it. Where there used to be a physical jolt, there is now, more often than not, simple stillness. Your heart rate doesn't spike at the sight of their name. Your shoulders don't tense reflexively at a memory that used to ambush you in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Your sleep isn't interrupted by the particular restlessness that used to accompany unresolved feelings about them, the kind of restlessness where your body seems to be working through something your mind hasn't fully processed yet. This physical calm is one of the most trustworthy signs of genuine indifference, more trustworthy in some ways than anything you could consciously decide to believe about yourself, because the body doesn't lie the way the mind sometimes does. If your body is at rest around the subject of them, it's because there's genuinely nothing left there requiring your body's alarm system. This matters because it explains why real indifference feels so different from simply suppressing feelings, gritting your teeth and pretending not to care, while your body quietly absorbs all the tension you're refusing to acknowledge. Suppression has a cost, and the cost shows up somewhere, in headaches, in tight shoulders, in a stomach that's perpetually a little unsettled without any obvious cause. Genuine indifference has no such cost because there's nothing being suppressed. The calm is not a performance your body is straining to maintain. It's simply the honest physical state of a person who has actually processed what happened and moved all the way through it, out the other side, into a body that has finally been allowed to rest. Redefining what safety feels like. Part of what made the old relationship so disorienting in retrospect was the way safety and anxiety became tangled together in a single package. The way affection, when it came, arrived unpredictably enough that you learned to associate even the good moments with an undercurrent of tension, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the withdrawal that'll. Why seem to follow closeness? That tangle doesn't undo itself the moment the relationship ends. For a while afterward, your nervous system might still expect this pattern from anyone who gets close, might still brace for withdrawal even when nothing about the new situation suggests it's coming. One of the deeper forms of healing that accompanies genuine indifference toward your ex is the slow untangling of that association, the rebuilding of a sense of safety that doesn't come preloaded with anxiety. This shows up in how you experience new closeness now, whether in friendships or in a new relationship, if and when you're ready for one. You notice with something like relief that you're not constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal, not interpreting an ordinary busy day as evidence of pulling away, not requiring constant reassurance to feel secure. This is not because the new person is necessarily more consistent than your ex was, though hopefully they are. It's because you yourself have recalibrated, have relearned what safety actually feels like in the body, separate from the specific anxious hypervigilance that used to define your experience of intimacy. This recalibration is one of the most important and least discussed outcomes of the work you've done to reach indifference. It's not just that you stopped caring about a specific person. It's that you rebuilt your entire relationship to closeness itself, learning slowly and through direct experience that not every relationship has to carry the same instability the last one did, that safety is available to you again, and that your own nervous system, given enough time and enough evidence to the contrary, is fully capable of learning to trust it. The stories you no longer tell. For a long time, this relationship was probably one of the central stories you told, to friends processing it with you, to yourself in the quiet moments when you were trying to make sense of what happened, maybe even to a therapist who helped you untangle the more confusing parts of it. Stories have a purpose in the early stages of healing. They help you organize a chaotic experience into something coherent, something you can hold onto and examine, something that makes the pain feel less random and more comprehensible. But stories can also become a home you stay in longer than necessary, a familiar shape you keep returning to even after it has stopped serving its original purpose. One of the quieter signs of genuine indifference is noticing that you've simply stopped telling this particular story, not because you've decided to suppress it, but because it no longer feels urgent to tell. A new friend might ask about your dating history, and you might mention the relationship briefly, factually, without the elaborate detail you once needed to include, without the emotional weight that used to accompany every retelling. The story has become smaller, not because what happened matters less in some abstract sense, but because it has stopped being the story you're currently living inside of. This shift from a story you're still processing to a story you've simply finished with is worth noticing, because it tells you something important about where your energy actually lives now. You are not currently a person defined by what happened in that relationship. You are a person who once went through something difficult, learned from it, and moved into a life that has plenty of other stories in it now, stories that feel more urgent, more alive, more connected to who you're actually becoming. The old story hasn't been erased. It's simply taken its proper place among many other chapters, no longer the loudest one in the room, when people ask if you've forgiven them. Occasionally someone will ask, with genuine curiosity, whether you've forgiven your ex, as though forgiveness is the necessary final step in any healing journey, the box that must be checked before you're allowed to call yourself fully recovered. This question deserves a more honest answer than the simple yes or no it's usually looking for, because forgiveness, in the way people typically mean it, isn't actually a requirement for the peace you've built. You don't need to declare forgiveness to have moved past something. You don't need to feel warmth toward them or wish them well or absolve them of what they did in order to be genuinely, completely indifferent to their presence in your life. Indifference and forgiveness are not the same thing, and conflating them can create unnecessary pressure to perform a feeling you don't actually have, just to satisfy an expectation that healing must look a certain way. It's entirely possible to feel nothing about someone without ever formally forgiving them for what they did, and that nothing is not evidence of unresolved bitterness. It's evidence that the question of forgiveness has simply become irrelevant to your life, because your life no longer requires their redemption, their remorse, or your absolution of them to keep moving forward. If forgiveness ever arrives for you in whatever form it takes, let it arrive on its own terms without forcing it or performing it for anyone else's benefit. And if it doesn't arrive, that's fine too. Your peace was never contingent on it. What matters is not whether you've forgiven them in some formal, declared sense. What matters is that you've stopped needing anything from them at all, forgiveness included, and that kind of freedom is more complete, in its own way, than forgiveness could have ever been. The practical shape of a day without them in it. It can help sometimes to look at the actual, literal shape of an ordinary day and notice how completely it has been reclaimed. Morning used to begin for a while with a reflexive check of your phone, a small flicker of anticipation or dread depending on what state things were in that week. Now morning begins with whatever actually matters to you: coffee, a walk, the specific quiet of starting your day on your own terms, unburdened by the question of what you might find waiting for you. Your commute, once filled with rehearsed conversations you'd never have, is now filled with a podcast you're actually interested in, or music you actually enjoy, or simply the pleasant blankness of a mind that isn't working overtime on a problem that was never actually solvable. Your evenings, once susceptible to a particular kind of loneliness that made you vulnerable to reaching out when you shouldn't have, are now simply evenings spent however you choose to spend them, without the specific ache that used to arrive right around the time you knew from experience they were most likely to be free, most likely to be thinking about reaching out themselves, most likely to catch you at your most vulnerable. This reclaimed shape of an ordinary day is, in many ways, the truest measure of everything indifference has given you. It's not abstract, it's not a feeling you have to search for or convince yourself of. It's simply the concrete fact of how your hours are spent now, unoccupied by a person who used to occupy far more of them than you probably realized at the time. Look at your actual day, hour by hour, and notice how little of it has anything to do with them at all. That noticing is its own kind of proof, more convincing than any amount of reasoning about whether you've truly moved on. Letting go of the need for a neat ending. One of the harder adjustments in reaching genuine indifference is letting go of the expectation that this story needed to end with some kind of neat, satisfying conclusion, a final conversation, a clear resolution, a moment where everything made sense in retrospect. Real life rarely provides that kind of narrative closure, and relationships that end badly or confusingly are especially unlikely to wrap up with the clarity you might have wanted. You might never get a clear answer for why things happened the way they did. You might never fully understand the parts of their behavior that confused you most. The story might simply trail off, unfinished in the way most real stories are, without a final scene that ties everything together. Making peace with this lack of neat conclusion is its own form of healing, separate from but related to the indifference you feel toward them specifically. It requires accepting that some questions simply won't be answered, that some confusion will remain permanently unresolved, and that your life can still be full and complete and peaceful despite that lack of resolution. This is a harder kind of acceptance than the more straightforward act of moving past a person, because it asks you to tolerate ambiguity, to let a story end without a proper ending, to trust that you don't actually need every loose thread tied off in order to move forward with your life. What makes this possible ultimately is realizing that the neat ending you once thought you needed was never actually necessary for your peace. You built that peace anyway, without it, out of your own clarity and your own choices, proving in the process that closure was never something someone else needed to hand you. It was always something you were capable of generating yourself, messy unanswered questions and all, and that capability is one of the most valuable things you've discovered about yourself in the process of getting here. The kind of person you're becoming. Every difficult experience leaves a mark on the person who survives it, and it's worth asking, honestly, what kind of mark this one has left on you. Not the mark of bitterness, not the mark of permanent guardedness, but something more specific and more useful. A clearer sense of what you will and won't accept in the relationships that come next, a sharper eye for the early signs of the patterns that hurt you before, a deeper commitment to being honest with yourself even when the honest answer is uncomfortable. You're becoming someone who trusts her own read on situations rather than talking herself out of it. You are becoming someone who understands that love, real love, doesn't require chronic anxiety as a baseline condition, that safety and intimacy can coexist without one constantly threatening the other. You're becoming someone who knows, from direct experience rather than second-hand advice, that she can survive heartbreak and come out the other side not diminished but genuinely stronger, more self-possessed, more clear about who she is and what she deserves. This is the person indifference has been quietly building this whole time, underneath all the smaller, less dramatic moments of choosing not to check, choosing not to reach out, choosing to sit with discomfort instead of chasing relief in the wrong direction. She didn't arrive all at once. She was built the same way indifference itself was built, slowly, through accumulated choices that felt small in the moment and only reveal their significance in retrospect. She is, by any honest measure, a more complete version of who you were before any of this happened, carrying forward everything the difficulty taught her, leaving behind everything that no longer serves her, including, finally and completely, the need to care about someone who stopped earning that care a long time ago. What you would tell the version of you who was still hoping. If you could sit down across from the version of yourself who existed a year ago, or 6 months ago, or however long it's been since this all started, still checking her phone, still hoping for the message that would explain everything, still measuring her worth against whether they'd reach out, what would you tell her? Not to rush, probably. Not to feel ashamed of how much it hurt, or how long it took, or how many times she slipped back into old habits after promising herself she wouldn't. You'd probably tell her that the peace she was so desperate to feel was closer than she thought, not because time alone would deliver it, but because every hard choice she was making, every night she didn't reach out, every trigger she survived without unraveling completely, was quietly building toward exactly the outcome she couldn't yet imagine. You might tell her that the explanation she was so sure she needed would turn out to be optional, that she'd build her own understanding eventually, sturdier than anything they could have offered her. You might tell her that the apology she was waiting for would either never come or would matter far less than she expected by the time it did, if it ever did. You might tell her, most importantly, that the version of herself waiting on the other side of all this work was not a smaller, more guarded, more cynical person, but a fuller one, more herself than she'd ever been while trying to shrink to fit into someone else's inconsistency. This exercise, imagining the conversation between who you are now and who you were then, is worth returning to whenever you want a clear measure of how far you've actually traveled. The distance between those two versions of yourself is not abstract. It's concrete, measurable in 1,000 small ways, in how you sleep, in how you spend your evenings, in what your mind reaches for in idle moments. That distance is the whole story of your healing, condensed into a single, honest comparison, and it's a story worth being proud of, not because the ending is dramatic, but because the ordinary peace you've built was so genuinely hard-won. Indifference as a form of respect for yourself. It's worth naming plainly that choosing not to care anymore is not a passive thing that simply happened to you over time, even though it can feel that way in retrospect. It was, underneath all the small, unremarkable moments that built it, an act of respect for yourself, repeated so many times that it eventually became your default state rather than something you had to consciously choose each day. Every time you didn't respond to a message designed to pull you back in, you were saying, in effect, that your peace mattered more than the temporary relief of reconnecting. Every time you resisted the urge to check on them, you were saying that your own attention was too valuable to keep spending on someone who had already shown you what he was willing to offer. This is worth understanding as respect rather than simply as recovery, because it reframes the entire process in a way that gives you more credit than the passive language of healing sometimes allows. You didn't just wait for the pain to fade. You actively, repeatedly chose yourself over the old pull toward them, and that repeated choosing is what respect actually looks like in practice. It's not a grand, one-time declaration. It's the accumulation of small moments where you decided that you were worth more consideration than you were giving yourself, while you were still caring about someone who had already demonstrated he wasn't going to reciprocate that care consistently. Understanding indifference this way, as an ongoing act of self-respect rather than a passive emotional state, changes how you might think about maintaining it going forward. It's not something you have to hope stays intact. It's something you continue to build in smaller ways now, through the same basic principle that got you here, choosing, consistently, to treat your own attention, your own peace, your own energy as things worth protecting, regardless of who or what is asking you to spend them elsewhere. The difference this makes for whoever comes next. If there is someone new in your future, whether that person has already arrived or is still somewhere ahead of you, the work you've done to reach this indifference will shape that relationship in ways you might not fully anticipate yet. You will bring to it a nervous system that isn't automatically braced for withdrawal, a sense of security that doesn't depend on constant reassurance, a capacity for presence that isn't split between the person in front of you and a ghost of someone who used to matter far more than he should have been allowed to. This is not a small gift to bring into a new relationship. It's one of the most valuable things you can offer someone, the simple, uncomplicated ability to be fully there with them, unclouded by an old story still quietly running in the background. You will also bring a clearer sense of your own boundaries, a sharper instinct for the early signs of the patterns that hurt you before, and a willingness to name discomfort early rather than waiting, as you might have once, for it to become undeniable before you addressed it. This isn't cynicism about new relationships. It's wisdom earned the hard way that makes you a better partner precisely because you're no longer willing to abandon your own needs in the hope that someone will eventually meet them if you're patient and accommodating enough. Whoever comes next, if anyone does, will be meeting a version of you shaped by everything you've learned, not damaged by it. That distinction matters enormously. The relationship that hurt you does not have to become a permanent handicap in every relationship that follows. It can instead become the exact thing that makes the next one better, more honest, more secure, because you're bringing to it a self that has already done the hard work of learning what safety actually requires and what it doesn't. When you realize you haven't thought about this in months, there will likely come a point further down the road than where you are now if you're still in the early stages of this, when you realize you haven't thought about any of this in months. Not the relationship, not the ending, not the indifference itself, none of it. You'll be going about your life, absorbed in whatever is actually happening in it, and it will occur to you, almost as an afterthought, that an entire season has passed without this subject crossing your mind at all. This realization tends to arrive with a small, quiet kind of surprise, not because you doubted you'd get here eventually, but because the actual arrival is so much less dramatic than you might have imagined it would be. This is, in many ways, the final and most complete form indifference takes, the point where it stops being something you're actively practicing or maintaining and becomes simply a fact about your life, unremarkable, unexamined, no longer requiring any attention at all. You don't have to remind yourself not to care anymore. You just don't, the same way you don't have to remind yourself not to think about a stranger you passed on the street once, years ago, whose face you can no longer even recall clearly. This is what full healing eventually looks like, not a dramatic final scene, but a gradual fading into irrelevance so complete that you eventually forget to notice it happened at all. When this moment arrives for you, and it will, let it be a quiet confirmation of everything you already suspected about your own resilience. You built this. Nobody handed it to you, and nobody can take it away from you now, because it isn't built on anything external, not on their behavior, not on an apology, not on any resolution you were once so sure you needed. It's built entirely on the work you did, quietly and consistently, over however long it took, and it belongs to you now completely, the way your own life was always supposed to belong to you. The anniversary that passes like any other day. There's a specific date, or maybe a handful of them, that used to carry weight, the day you met, the day it ended, a birthday you once knew by heart and probably still remember, whether you want to or not. In the early aftermath, these dates loomed, marked in some quiet corner of your awareness weeks in advance, dreaded or anticipated or both at once, treated as significant even when you tried to convince yourself they weren't. You braced for them. You made plans to distract yourself, or you didn't, and either way the date itself tended to carry an emotional charge disproportionate to what it actually was, which was, in the end, just a day on a calendar. One of the clearest markers of how far you've come is noticing, sometimes only after the fact, that one of these dates has passed without your even registering it. You'll be a week past it before you realize, with a kind of mild surprise, that the day came and went and you didn't think about it at all, didn't feel the old bracing, didn't notice the date on the calendar carrying any weight whatsoever. This is not something you can force. You can't decide in advance that this year the anniversary won't matter, because that decision itself is a form of attention, a bracing against the date rather than genuine indifference to it. The dates that stop mattering do so on their own timeline, quietly, without any effort on your part, and their eventual irrelevance is one of the most satisfying proofs available that the work you did actually took hold. When this happens, don't feel obligated to make it mean anything more dramatic than it does. It doesn't require a journal entry or a moment of reflection. It can simply be what it is, a day that used to matter and now doesn't, folded seamlessly into the ordinary rhythm of your life, indistinguishable from any other day on the calendar. That seamlessness is the whole point. It's what healing looks like when it's finally complete, not a scar you have to manage carefully around significant dates, but simply the absence of any scar at all. Why you don't need to explain this piece to anyone. There may be people in your life who want an explanation for how you got here, who ask, with genuine curiosity or sometimes with a kind of skepticism, how you managed to stop caring so completely about someone who once meant so much to you. You don't owe anyone a full accounting of the process. You don't need to justify your peace by walking someone through every stage of the healing that got you here, and you certainly don't need to defend it against people who seem to think it happened too quickly, or too completely, or in a way that doesn't match their expectations of how heartbreak is supposed to work. Your peace is not a case you need to argue. It doesn't require external validation to be legitimate, and it doesn't need to be explained in a way that satisfies someone else's curiosity about your inner life. If someone asks how you did it, you can answer as briefly or as fully as you want, but you are never obligated to produce evidence, to justify the timeline, to prove that your indifference is real by some standard someone else has decided is appropriate. You know what it took. You know the nights it cost you, the discipline it required, the small choices that eventually built into this quiet, unremarkable peace. That knowledge is enough. It doesn't need an audience to be true. This is worth remembering because there will occasionally be people, even well-meaning ones, who seem almost invested in complicating your peace, who ask pointed questions designed to test whether it's real, who seem to want you to admit to some hidden residue of feeling that would make the story more relatable, more dramatic, more consistent with their own experience of heartbreak. You don't have to give them that. You're allowed to simply say that you're at peace and let that be the whole answer, without further explanation, without further proof, without needing anyone else to believe it before it becomes true for you. The version of love you're capable of now. It's worth ending on this because it's ultimately the most important thing this whole process has given you access to, a clearer, more grounded understanding of what love is actually supposed to feel like, now that you've lived through an extended experience of what it isn't. Love is not supposed to require constant vigilance. It is not supposed to keep you guessing, keep you anxious, keep you organizing your own behavior around someone else's unpredictability in the hope of finally earning consistency you were never actually going to receive. You know this now not as an abstract idea you picked up from a book or a conversation, but as something you learned directly, through years or months of living the alternative and feeling, in your body, exactly how wrong it was. This knowledge changes what you're capable of recognizing and accepting going forward. You are less likely now to mistake anxiety for chemistry, less likely to interpret inconsistency as mysterious depth, less likely to accept crumbs of attention as though they were a full meal simply because you've forgotten, for a while, what an actual full meal feels like. You know now. You carry that knowledge forward into whatever comes next, and it will protect you, quietly and reliably, from repeating a pattern that once cost you so much of yourself. More than that, you carry forward the direct, embodied knowledge that you are capable of real love, the kind that gives fully without losing yourself in the process, the kind that doesn't require you to shrink or perform or constantly manage someone else's emotional weather in order to be received. You loved deeply once in circumstances that made it very hard to be loved back consistently, and you survived that, and you are still, after everything, someone capable of loving again, more wisely now, more securely, with a clearer sense of what you deserve in return. That capacity was never actually in question. It was just waiting this whole time for the right circumstances to be received the way it always deserved to be, the small rituals that mark the chain. Healing rarely announces itself in a single dramatic gesture, but it often leaves behind small, specific rituals that mark its progress if you look back and notice them. Maybe there was a night you finally deleted the last photos you'd been keeping, not because you needed to prove anything to anyone, but because you simply didn't need them anymore, and the deleting itself felt less like an act of grief and more like ordinary housekeeping. Maybe there was a day you rearranged the furniture in a room that used to hold a specific memory, not out of any dramatic need to erase the past, but because you wanted the space to reflect the life you're actually living now instead of the one that used to happen there. Maybe there was a moment you finally stopped wearing a piece of jewelry, or using a mug, or listening to a particular playlist, not with any ceremony, but simply because it stopped feeling relevant to hold on to. These small rituals are worth noticing, because they're often more honest indicators of your healing than any conscious thought you could have about it. You don't plan them in advance, usually. They happen because some part of you has already moved on and is simply catching the rest of you up on the news. Look back over the last several months and see if you can identify a few of these moments, small, undramatic, easy to miss in the moment they happened. Each one is a marker, a small stone left along the path you've walked to get here, proof that the distance between who you were and who you are now is real and measurable, even if it never felt like a single decisive leap while you were making it. What you owe yourself now. Having done this work, having built this piece out of so many quiet, unglamorous choices, it's worth asking what you owe yourself now on the other side of it. Not obligation in a heavy sense, but a kind of gentle accounting of what this version of you, having survived what she survived, deserves from the life she's building next. She deserves patience with herself on the days when an old feeling still surfaces unexpectedly, without treating that surfacing as failure. She deserves credit for the discipline it took to get here, credit she might be tempted to withhold from herself because the process felt, most days, like nothing more than getting through an ordinary afternoon. She deserves, too, the willingness to actually enjoy what she's built, rather than treating this piece as a fragile thing to be protected anxiously, watched carefully for cracks. The piece is not fragile. It's not a temporary state you have to guard against collapse. It's solid, built the way anything solid gets built, slowly, out of real material, tested repeatedly, and holding up every time. You are allowed to trust it. You are allowed to stop bracing for its disappearance and simply live inside it, the way you'd live inside any other true and settled fact about your life. Most of all, she deserves to carry forward into whatever comes next the full recognition of what she accomplished here, not as a story she tells to prove something to anyone else, but as a quiet, private knowledge she carries with her always, that she loved fully, that she survived something difficult, that she built her own way back to peace without needing anyone else's help or permission or a apology to get there, and that whatever comes next in her life, she is meeting it as someone who has already proven, beyond any doubt, exactly how strong she actually is. The difference between closure and completion. People talk about closure as though it's a single event, a door that swings shut in one clean motion, but the more honest way to describe what actually happens is completion, a slower, less dramatic process where a story simply finishes running its course, thread by thread, until there's nothing left unresolved that actually requires resolving. Closure in the popular imagination usually involves the other person, a final conversation, an admission, a moment where they finally say the thing you needed to hear. Completion doesn't require any of that. It happens entirely on your side, built out of your own understanding, your own forgiveness of yourself for whatever you think you did wrong, your own decision that the story has told itself as fully as it's going to and doesn't need anything further from anyone to be considered finished. You may never get the conversation you once thought you needed. You may never hear the words that would have, in your imagination, tied everything together into a neat and satisfying package. And it turns out, as you've discovered by living through it, that the absence of that conversation doesn't actually prevent completion from happening. You complete the story anyway, using only the material you have, filling in the parts you'll never know for certain with your own hard-won clarity, and the story closes just as fully as it would have with their participation, maybe even more fully, because it closes on terms you set entirely for yourself. This distinction matters because it frees you from waiting for something that was never actually necessary. If you're still hoping for a specific kind of closure from them, a conversation, an admission, a moment of mutual understanding, it might help to recognize that the completion you actually need has probably already happened or is already well underway, regardless of whether that external event ever arrives. You don't need their participation to finish this. You never did. You only needed enough time and enough of your own effort to arrive at the understanding you were always capable of building on your own. Carrying this forward without carrying the weight. There's a way to hold everything you've learned from this experience without continuing to carry the emotional weight that used to accompany it, and learning to separate the two is one of the final, subtler skills involved in complete healing. The lessons are worth keeping. The pattern recognition, the clearer boundaries, the sharper instinct for what healthy closeness actually feels like, all of that is valuable, worth carrying forward into everything you build next. But the weight, the actual emotional heaviness of the experience itself, doesn't have to travel with the lessons. You can extract the wisdom and set down the burden, keeping what serves you and releasing what doesn't, and this separation is possible precisely because you've reached the kind of indifference this entire piece has been describing. This is, in some ways, the final test of whether the healing is complete. Can you talk about what happened when it comes up without it costing you anything to talk about it? Can you reference the relationship, briefly and factually, in conversation with a new person, without your voice changing, without your body tensing, without the old weight settling back onto your chest the moment the subject arises? If the answer is yes, and for most people who have done this work honestly, it eventually is, then you've achieved something rarer and more valuable than simply not caring about a specific person. You've achieved the ability to hold your own history lightly, informed by it without being burdened by it, shaped by it without being defined by it. This is what it means, ultimately, to be free. Not the absence of a past, not a life with no difficult chapters in it, but the capacity to carry those chapters forward as simply part of your story, informative and occasionally instructive, but no longer heavy, no longer capable of derailing an otherwise good day, no longer anything you have to brace yourself against. You've built that capacity now. It's yours permanently, regardless of what comes next, and it is one of the most valuable things a difficult experience can ever leave behind in the person who survives it. The ordinary miracle of not thinking about it. There is something almost miraculous, when you really sit with it, about the ordinary fact of not thinking about something that once consumed nearly every spare corner of your mind. In the thick of it, this outcome would have seemed impossible, a fantasy you reached for on the hardest nights, a promise other people made that you weren't sure you believed. Everyone tells you in the early stages of heartbreak that it gets better, that you'll stop thinking about them eventually, and in the moment, exhausted and raw, that promise can feel like a platitude, something people say because it's kind rather than because it's true. And then, somehow, without any single dramatic turning point you could point to, it becomes true. You go a day, then a week, then a month, without the thought crossing your mind at all, and when you finally notice this, it lands not as a triumphant realization, but as a simple, almost mundane fact about your life, the way you might notice you haven't thought about a childhood fear in years, or a worry that used to keep you up at night that simply stopped being relevant at some point you can't cue. You identify, this is the ordinary miracle sitting underneath everything this piece has described. Not indifference as a grand achievement, not moving on as a dramatic victory, but simply the quiet, undeniable fact that a person who once occupied so much of your inner life now occupies almost none of it, and your days are simply better for it, in ways so basic and so pervasive that you might forget to notice them at all. If you're still in the middle of this process, still waiting for that ordinary miracle to arrive in your own life, let this be a reminder that it is arriving, even on the days it doesn't feel like it, even during the weeks when an old feeling resurfaces and makes you wonder if you're actually making any progress at all. You are. The progress is happening in exactly the same undramatic, cumulative way it happened for everyone who has ever walked this path before you, one choice at a time, one undisturbed morning at a time, until eventually the disturbance simply stops arriving, and what's left in its place is just your life, quiet and whole and entirely your own again. What this piece is not waiting on. It's worth listing plainly everything this piece is not waiting on, because doing so can be clarifying in a way that abstract reassurance sometimes isn't. It is not waiting on them reaching out. It is not waiting on them apologizing. It is not waiting on them explaining themselves, changing, growing, seeing you clearly at last, regretting what happened, or ever in any capacity, acknowledging the full weight of what the relationship cost you. It is not waiting on a mutual friend delivering news that they're struggling, or thriving, or thinking about you, or asking after you. It is not waiting on enough time passing, as though a specific number on a calendar will unlock a feeling that isn't already available to you now. It is not waiting on a new relationship arriving to prove that you're desirable, worthy, capable of being chosen by someone else. It is not waiting on anything external at all. This piece is complete on its own terms, built entirely out of what you've already done, already chosen, already survived. There is nothing outstanding, nothing pending, nothing you're still holding your breath for. Every condition that might have once felt necessary for your healing has either already been met, quietly and without fanfare, or has revealed itself to be unnecessary after all, a requirement you invented in the early days of grief that your actual healing simply outgrew. You are not in a waiting room anymore. You already arrived sometime in the accumulation of ordinary days, and the life you're living now is not a holding pattern before some better, more resolved future begins. It is the resolved future. It is already here, and it was built entirely by you. The last thing worth saying. If everything else in this piece fades from memory, let this remain. You did not need them to become who you are now. You built this piece, this indifference, this quiet, sturdy freedom, entirely out of your own effort, your own discipline, your own repeated willingness to choose yourself even on the nights it would have been easier not to. Nobody handed this to you. Nobody made it easy. You earned every bit of the calm you're standing in now, through a process that asked more of you than you probably expected it to, and you met that demand again and again until the demand itself stopped existing. That is the real story here, not the story of what they did or didn't do, not the story of what they're feeling now or whether they've changed or whether they think about you at all. The real story is the one about you, about what you're capable of when you decide, finally and completely, to stop waiting for someone else to give you what you can build for yourself. You built it, it's yours. And whatever comes next in your life, whoever you become, whatever you go on to create, you will be building it from this foundation, solid and entirely your own, unshakable by anything they might ever do or say or fail to do or say, because it was never actually about them to begin with. It was always about you, finding your way back to yourself, and you found it. A final word on patience with the process. If you're reading this while still somewhere in the middle of it, still checking more than you'd like to admit, still feeling the old pull on harder days, none of what's been described here is meant to suggest that you're behind, or doing it wrong, or somehow failing at a process that seems to have gone so smoothly for the version of healing described through. Out this piece, every path to indifference looks different in its particulars, even if the underlying shape is similar. Some people arrive here in months, some take years. Some take a winding route full of setbacks, moments of apparent progress followed by nights that feel like starting over completely, before the piece finally settles in for good. None of that variation says anything about your worth, your strength, or your ultimate capacity to get to exactly the place this piece has been describing. What matters is not the speed of your arrival, but the direction you keep choosing, day after day, even on the days that direction feels impossibly slow. Every time you choose not to check, not to reach out, not to feed the old story one more piece of your attention, you are moving, even if it doesn't feel like movement in the moment. The accumulation is happening whether or not you can feel it happening, the same way it happened for every single person who has ever walked this exact path before you and eventually found their way to the other side of it. You will too. Not because you're forcing it and not because you're waiting passively for time to do the work for you, but because you are already doing the work in exactly the way it needs to be done, one ordinary, unglamorous choice at a time. Trust that. Trust the process even on the days it doesn't feel like progress. Trust that the piece being described here is not a special outcome reserved for people who healed more easily or more completely than you have. It is available to you too, built out of the same raw material everyone else used to get there. Time, patience, and the simple, repeated decision to keep choosing yourself, even when choosing yourself is the harder option in the moment. You are already on your way, you have been the whole time, and you will arrive in your own time at exactly the piece this entire piece has been trying to describe. What you got to keep. At the end of everything, after the checking has stopped and the triggers have lost their teeth and the anniversaries pass unnoticed, and the story has shrunk down to a footnote you mention only in passing, it's worth taking stock of exactly what you get to keep from all of this, because the list is longer and more valuable than it might have seemed possible to imagine while you were still in the hardest part of it. You get to keep the clarity about what you will and won't accept from another person, a clarity that no longer has to be relearned the hard way because you already learned it once thoroughly at real cost. You get to keep the restored trust in your own perception, the confidence that your gut instincts are worth listening to, that you don't need to talk yourself out of discomfort just because someone else insists there's nothing to be uncomfortable about. You get to keep the deepened relationships with the people who stood by you through this, the friends who listened, the family who worried, the version of connection that got stronger precisely because you leaned on it during the hardest stretch of your healing. You get to keep the specific, hard-won knowledge that you are capable of surviving something that once felt unsurvivable, a knowledge that will serve you the next time life asks something difficult of you, whatever shape that difficulty happens to take. You get to keep the redirected energy, the attention that used to be spent monitoring someone else's inconsistency, now permanently available for your own goals, your own growth, your own life, wherever you choose to point it next. And you get to keep, perhaps most importantly of all, the proof, walking around in the ordinary shape of your own daily existence, that you are someone who chooses herself, reliably and repeatedly, even when choosing herself is the harder, less immediately gratifying option. That proof doesn't expire. It doesn't depend on this particular relationship remaining relevant to your life. It becomes simply a fact about who you are now, carried forward into every future choice, every future relationship, every future difficulty you'll ever face. A quiet, permanent inheritance from a season of your life that hurt tremendously and gave you, in exchange, more strength and clarity and self-possession than you ever could have predicted it would. This is what indifference gives back to you in the end, not just the absence of pain, though that alone would have been enough. Something larger than that, a whole self, returned to you, more solid and more entirely your own than the self that existed before any of this began. The life that was waiting on the other side. There was a life waiting for you this whole time, on the other side of all this difficulty, and it's worth picturing it clearly now that you've largely arrived there, because sometimes the destination is easier to appreciate once you can see it whole rather than piece by piece along the way. It's a life where your mornings belong entirely to you, unshadowed by dread or anticipation about anyone else's silence. It's a life where your evenings are filled with whatever genuinely interests you, rather than braced against the particular loneliness that used to make you vulnerable to reaching backward. It's a life where the people around you get your full attention, your full presence, your full capacity for connection, because none of it is being quietly siphoned off toward someone who stopped deserving that investment a long time ago. It's a life, too, where your own company has become something you actually enjoy, where solitude feels like rest rather than exposure, where you can sit with your own thoughts without those thoughts automatically routing themselves toward an old wound. It's a life where new possibilities, whether in love or work or simple everyday adventure, feel genuinely open to you, unburdened by comparison to a past that has finally, completely stopped asking anything of you. This is the life you were building toward the entire time, even during the hardest, least hopeful stretches of the process, even on the nights you couldn't imagine ever arriving here. You're here now, or close enough to hear that the remaining distance is measured in weeks or months, rather than the years it might have once felt like. Look around at what you've built. Let yourself actually see it, not as a consolation prize for a relationship that didn't work out, but as the real, full, deserved outcome of everything you survived and everything you chose again and again on your own behalf. This was always the destination. You just had to walk the whole distance to get here, and you did, and it was worth every difficult step it took. One more thing worth remembering. Somewhere in all of this, it's easy to lose sight of a simple fact worth restating plainly before the final word. None of this required you to become someone harder, colder, or less capable of love than you were before. If anything, the opposite happened. You became someone more discerning about where your love goes, more protective of your own peace, more able to recognize the difference between a connection that nourishes you and one that only ever asked you to keep shrinking to accommodate its limits. That is not a loss. That is growth in its most practical, most useful form, the kind that shows up not in how you feel about the past, but in how you move through everything that comes after it. You are allowed to feel proud of that growth quietly, without needing to perform it for anyone. You are allowed to notice, with something like wonder, how far you've traveled from the version of yourself who once thought this peace might never arrive. And you are allowed, finally, to simply live inside the life you've built, without narrating it, without measuring it, without needing it to mean anything more than what it already is, your own, entirely and genuinely at peace. Standing here now. Take a moment before this ends to actually stand inside where you are right now, instead of rushing past it toward whatever comes next. You have done something genuinely difficult. You have taken a heart that was pointed for a long time toward someone who couldn't consistently meet it, and you redirected that heart, patiently and deliberately, back toward a life that was always more deserving of it. That redirection didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen quickly, and it definitely didn't happen because you stopped caring in some general sense about connection or love or being close to another person. It happened because you learned, specifically and precisely, to stop caring about one particular outcome that was never going to arrive, freeing up everything you had to offer for outcomes that actually could. This is worth sitting with fully, before moving forward into whatever the next chapter holds. Not as a victory lap and not as proof of anything you need to demonstrate to anyone else, but simply as an honest accounting of where you stand. You stand here whole. You stand here capable. You stand here having proven, to yourself if to no one else, that you can walk through something that once felt like it might undo you completely and come out the other side more solid than you went in. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, one of the more significant things a person can accomplish, quietly, without applause, over the ordinary, unremarkable course of days that add up, eventually, into an entire transformed life. What remains true regardless? Whatever happens next, whether they ever reach out or never do, whether they change or stay exactly the same, whether you hear about their life again or never learn another thing about it, none of it changes what remains true about the peace you've built. This peace was never contingent on their behavior, and it isn't now, and it won't be in the future, regardless of what they do with the rest of their life. You built something durable, something that doesn't depend on outside conditions to hold steady, and that durability is the entire point. You are not one message away from unraveling. You are not one glimpse of their life away from being pulled backward. You are simply solidly on the other side of this now, and the ground you're standing on isn't going anywhere. That's the whole truth of it, plain and unremarkable and completely sufficient. You don't need anything more dramatic than that. You needed to stop caring, and you did, and what's left in the space that caring used to occupy is simply your life, quiet and whole and entirely, finally, your own. The last ordinary morning of the old story. Somewhere unmarked and unnoticed at the time, there was a final morning when this whole subject still had some quiet pull on you, a last day when a stray thought about them still carried some faint residue of the old ache. You didn't know it was the last one when it happened. Nobody ever does. It passed like any other morning, and then it simply wasn't followed by another morning like it, and the story quietly finished the process of becoming past tense without any ceremony marking the transition. That morning already happened for you, whether you can pinpoint it or not, and everything since has simply been the life that was waiting on the other side of it, unfolding exactly as it was always going to, now that nothing about it depends on someone who stopped being able to touch it. Somewhere ahead of you, too, are countless more mornings just like the ones you're living now, ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way peace tends to be, full of your own plans and your own small joys and your own quiet momentum, entirely uninterrupted by a story that has, at long last, finished telling itself. That is what waits for you now morning after morning, for as long as you keep choosing to live inside the life you built rather than the one you left behind, which by this point is simply what living looks like for you, and it is, in every quiet, undramatic, hard-earned way, more than enough. It always was. It just took this long for you to finally, fully believe that too, and now that you do, nothing about it needs to be proven, argued for, or explained to anyone ever again. Closing, what indifference gives back to you. If you take one thing from all of this, let it be this: indifference is not a hardening, it is not a loss. It is not the death of some part of you that used to be capable of caring deeply. It is, instead, the return of everything that caring about the wrong thing for too long had quietly been costing you. It is your attention coming home. It is your energy finding its way back to a life that has been waiting, patiently, for you to notice it again. It is the proof, walking around in the ordinary shape of your unremarkable days, that you survived something that once felt unsurvivable, and came out the other side not bitter, not cold, not broken, but simply free. You didn't get here by trying to feel nothing. You got here by feeling everything fully for as long as it took, and then slowly choosing yourself enough times that the feeling had nowhere left to live. That is not a small accomplishment. It is one of the quietest, hardest, most important things a person can do, and you did it brick by brick, on days when nobody was watching and nothing about it felt like progress at all. There will be no ceremony for this. No one will hand you an award for the day you realized you'd stopped caring. It will simply be there one ordinary morning, sitting quietly where the old ache used to live, asking nothing of you, costing you nothing, requiring nothing from you but the simple, unremarkable act of living your life as though it belongs, at last, entirely to you, because it does. It always did, it just took this long and this much work for you to finally believe it, and that belief, once fully settled, doesn't need defending anymore. It simply becomes the quiet floor you stand on for everything that comes next, steady beneath every future choice, every future love, every future version of yourself still waiting patiently to be built. You gave that to yourself. Nobody else could have, and nobody else did. It was always going to have to be you, and it was, and here you are.